And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today and to remind you that all of our content can be found on our website, realtime1960s.com. And if you love what we're doing, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, get exclusive access to bonus content, and help us continue this deep dive into a truly fascinating decade. That's patreon.com/realtime1960s. And today, we continue our journey through my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1964. On the first episode, we covered films 10 and 9, The Naked Kiss and That Man from Rio. Last time, we got into number 8, The Pawnbroker, and today, we move on to films 7 and 6. So without further ado, the best of 64 at the movies, right now. And my 7th ranked film for 1964, Goldfinger, released in this country in December of that year, is based on the 7th James Bond novel by Ian Fleming, published in 1959. It is the 3rd Bond film after Dr. No and From Russia with Love, which made my top 10 lists for 62 and 63 respectively. But it's the first directed by Guy Hamilton, who would go on to direct 3 vastly inferior Bond films, Diamonds Are Forever with Sean Connery again in 71, and then with Roger Moore as Bond, Live and Let Die in 73, and arguably the worst Bond film ever made, The Man with the Golden Gun in 74. But with Goldfinger, Hamilton really set the Bond template in stone, establishing several features that would remain, including an extensive pre-credit sequence that has nothing to do with the primary plot, and also lots of tongue-in-cheek humor, especially double entendres, often sexual in nature. For example, as Bond is lounging in bed with the beautiful but doomed Jill Masterson, someone calls on the phone to invite him to dinner, and he says, "Not now. Something big's come up." I guess that one failed to penetrate the censor's red zone. Now, a more debatable permanent feature established by Hamilton was the reliance, which, as the series progressed, became, in my view, an over-reliance on gadgets. Goldfinger is really the first Bond film to include the patented early scene between Bond and Q, the gadget master played by Desmond Llewellyn, where Q explains Bond's new toys. Now, in the previous film, From Russia with Love, there is a scene where Q gives Bond a special briefcase with some added features. But here, we get the far more elaborate, tricked-out Aston Martin DB5, complete with tracking devices, smoke screen, revolving license plate, and an ejector seat. By the way, that scene with Q almost didn't happen in its final form. In the original screenplay, he just tells Bond that the car has some interesting features, and these were revealed one by one as surprises as the story unfolded. But producer Albert Broccoli said, no, we should tell the audience up front what the features are. They'll have a good time seeing how each is worked into the plot, which is what they did and continue to do throughout the series. And as I said, the Q sequence became a prototype, not just in Bond films, but other films as well. Lucius Fox, the Morgan Freeman character in the Dark Knight trilogy, who supplies Batman with various gadgets and cars, he could definitely be seen as a descendant of Q. Now, a number of elements from the novel were changed for the film. In the book, Auric Goldfinger and his criminal underlings planned to steal all the gold reserves from Fort Knox, which in reality would take well over a week. So in the film, they changed that plan to irradiating the vault with an atomic device. Also in the book, the villains never actually get into Fort Knox. The plot is foiled and they scatter, which would have made a terrible anticlimax for the film. So set designer Ken Adam, who had done such a great job on Dr. No with a shoestring budget, but had been unable to work on From Russia with Love as he was hired by Stanley Kubrick for Dr. Strangelove. One of his major achievements in this film, which had a much larger budget, equal to that of the first 2 films combined, was his creation of a kind of fantastical interior to Fort Knox, a set he basically made up out of thin air. So there's a reason that the phrase "as safe as Fort Knox" exists, as no one other than depository staff, not even the President of the United States, is allowed in there. The vault door is set on a 100-hour time lock and can only be opened by staff members who each have their own separate combination. On top of which, there were no photographs of the interior, so all Ken Adam had to go on was a handful of sketches that had appeared in a magazine article in the 1940s, which frankly looked pretty dull, sort of like the inside of a prison. So Broccoli, the hands-on producer, said, look, forget the real thing. Just let your imagination run wild. Turn this set into a kind of cinematic cathedral of gold, which is exactly what he did, and it's a fantastic set. So the strengths of Goldfinger are the aforementioned tongue-in-cheek humor, set design, pacing, excellent photography in Miami, Switzerland, and Kentucky around and over the actual Fort Knox, and just overall production values, with a handful of minor exceptions. Most glaringly, the opening sequence in Miami Beach has way too many rear projection, or what they called process shots, which unfortunately was necessary, because at that point in the production, early '64, Connery was still working on Marnie with Alfred Hitchcock. So all the Connery shots ostensibly in Miami were actually shot at Pinewood Studios in England. The cast, led by Connery, is very good, and in the case of the Goldfinger character, played by little-known German actor Gert Fröbe, the dubbing, which is often very sloppy in films of this era, is synced almost perfectly. The producers, by the way, had wanted Orson Welles for the Goldfinger part. He asked for too much money, so Theodore Bickel tested for it, but they had seen and liked Fröbe's performance as a child murderer in a German film. So they went with him, undoubtedly paying him far less than they would have had to pay Welles or Bickel. But he spoke no English, so he had to learn his part phonetically, and you never hear his real voice. But Michael Collins, an English actor, did just a fantastic job with the dubbing. Odd Job, Goldfinger's Korean enforcer who wields a deadly steel-brimmed bowler hat, is also a nice performance. He's played not by a Korean actor, but a Japanese-American wrestler, Harold Sakata, who had been a Silver Award-winning Olympic weightlifter for the U.S. in 1948. Sakata, who had no acting experience whatsoever, has no lines. His character is mute. But his intimidating presence is nicely accentuated by a disarming smirk. And like Robert Shaw in From Russia with Love, he proves to be a worthy adversary for Sean Connery. And finally, there are some wonderfully striking visual images. Most famously, the shot of Shirley Eaton as Jill Masterson, her body completely painted in gold, which made the cover of Life magazine in November of '64. And also the industrial laser, which was a fairly novel technology in 1964, at least to the general public. But this bright red laser beam comes perilously close to castrating Bond. That's another upgrade from the novel, by the way, in which Bond is merely threatened with dissection via circular saw. So all this makes for an entertaining hour and 50 minutes. And unlike its lesser follow-up, Thunderball, which is 20 minutes longer, Goldfinger does not overstay its welcome. So bottom line, the film achieves what it sets out to achieve, and it's very cinematic. Now, are there any ideas in the film, any wisdom, any nuance? No. I mean, from a conceptual standpoint, it's pretty close to a live-action cartoon, but, who goes to a Bond film for ideas or wisdom or nuance? It's supposed to be fun, and it is. So, superior Bond, but certainly the last of the series that I'll be covering on any of these top 10 podcasts, as things get markedly worse even than Thunderball, with 1967's You Only Live Twice, which is like bad TV, and the final Bond film of the 60s, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, released in '69, the only one starring George Lazenby, a pretty wooden actor. It's not bad, but it will not make my top 10 list for that year, which, like '62, '67, and '68, was an all-time great year for movies. Moving on to my 6th ranked film, French New Wave director Francois Truffaut's fourth production, The Soft Skin, which he described as a cold clinical autopsy of adultery. And this is the first of many Truffaut films directly influenced by his admiration for and association with Alfred Hitchcock. Before making this film, he had already interviewed Hitchcock extensively in Los Angeles for a full-length book, Hitchcock Truffaut, that was finally published to great acclaim in 1966. Now, The Soft Skin marks a shift for Truffaut, as really all it shares in common with his first three landmark films, The 400 Blows, Shoot the Piano Player, and Jules and Jim, is that it was shot in black and white, which Truffaut would only do twice more after this. The Wild Child in 1970, which is a period piece, and his final film, Confidentially Yours, released in '83, 1 year before he sadly died of a brain tumor at the age of 52. Just a terrible loss for cinema. Now, probably the greatest difference between The Soft Skin and those first three films is that it is not about outsiders, but about three fairly unexceptional everyday Parisians. Pierre, a literary editor and lecturer in his early 40s, played perfectly by Jean Dessy, although the actor grumbled for the rest of his life that the role had ruined his career because the character was unlikable, which I don't necessarily agree with. To me, he's more of a mixed bag. Pierre's wife, Franca, played with great passion by Nellie Benedetti, who was almost exclusively a stage actress, and Pierre's lover, Nicole, a flight attendant in her early 20s, played by Françoise Dorléac. I talked about Dorléac, the younger sister of Catherine Deneuve, in the episode I did on That Man from Rio, in which she starred with Jean-Paul Belmondo. Very different screen presence from her sister, who was, or is, I should say, she's still alive, a great actress of renowned beauty, but fairly cold, often cast as either frigid or neurotic. Whereas Dorléac, which was the real family name, had a very warm, kind of free-spirited presence. Unfortunately, she died even younger than Truffaut in a car accident in 1967. So the plot of this film concerning an extramarital affair could have easily been drawn from any run-of-the-mill soap opera or melodrama. At the beginning, Pierre flies to Lisbon to deliver a literary lecture. And after nearly missing his plane, the first of many fateful near misses in this film, he's struck by the beauty of one of the flight attendants, Nicole, who, as it turns out, along with the rest of the flight crew, is staying at his hotel in Lisbon. So after sharing a virtually silent elevator ride at that hotel with her and the plane's pilot, Pierre, with uncharacteristic boldness, you definitely get the sense that this man has never done this before, calls Nicole's room to ask her out for a drink. A proposal that Nicole, who has seen Pierre on TV, he's a minor celebrity, initially refuses but then calls back to accept, commencing an affair which continues, albeit with major logistical difficulties, back in Paris and then beyond, on a separate trip to Reims, where Pierre, who's there to introduce a documentary, is continually blocked from spending time with Nicole by this clueless, almost diabolically obnoxious local arts official who insists on monopolizing all of his time. And Pierre is either too polite or too cowardly, or both, to just blow the guy off. So he's frustrated, and Nicole is humiliated. So the illicit relationship survives that episode barely, but of course the lies necessary to conduct an affair beget lies and more lies, and finally Pierre gets sloppy and makes a grave error in judgment. He takes some photographs of himself and his lover with a timer. The wife finds the Photoshop ticket, and, well, you can guess the rest. But I did mention the wife was passionate, so I'll just leave it at that. The ending, by the way, which for me doesn't really work with the rest of the film, was drawn from an actual event, whereas the rest of the film is loosely based on Truffaut's own marriage, which was disintegrating at this time. And the domestic scenes of Pierre and his wife, Franca, were shot in Truffaut's own apartment, the same apartment where he returned to die in 1984. But Truffaut and co-writer Jean-Louis Richard's primary goal here was to create a film about adultery that was even-handed, fair to all three parties. And I think they largely succeeded. All three characters have their flaws and their virtues, so very human, not caricatures. And despite the Hitchcockian elements, which would become even more pronounced in Truffaut's next three films, there are insights here into relationships, generational differences, social etiquette, and hypocrisy that you don't necessarily find in Hitchcock's films, although it's not an entirely fair comparison, as Hitchcock did not write his films, Truffaut did. The Soft Skin was received respectfully by French critics, but was a box office bomb. And at the Cannes Film Festival, where it premiered in May of '64, half the audience walked out, which is absurd. But I have to think that that was due to expectations, that maybe this film was just a little too cold, a little too real for them, especially in comparison with Truffaut's first three films, which are also real, but as compensation, they have a kind of lightheartedness, a sweetness to balance that reality, which is really Truffaut's hallmark as a writer-director. Whereas this one, well, put it this way, it's as close to Ingmar Bergman as Truffaut would ever come in its ruthless dissection of human weakness and the resulting perils inherent in human relationships. Truffaut's own view of romantic love, according to his co-writer on this film, was that it was not meant to last, but rather to be enjoyed while it did last. And you do see that point of view expressed in many of his films. The music by Georges Delerue is a mixed bag. The opening theme, which is repeated throughout, is almost painfully beautiful in its romantic melancholy. But the faster kind of motoric suspense music is less effective and just too derivative of Bernard Herrmann, Hitchcock's frequent colleague, which I'm sure was done by Delerue on instructions from Truffaut, who actually hired Herrmann himself for his next film, Fahrenheit 451. So second-tier Truffaut, I would say, but, his second tier is substantially higher than most directors' first tier. His best films, My Desert Island Truffauts, would be first his 1959 debut, The 400 Blows, based on his own rough-and-tumble childhood, Shoot the Piano Player, an offbeat noir with comedic elements released the following year, Day for Night from '73, wonderful film about filmmaking, in which one scene from The Soft Skin is reproduced, but from the production perspective, as the crew tries to get an uncooperative cat to approach a food tray and drink some milk off of it, which you would think would be easy, but proves nearly impossible. It's a very funny scene. And finally, The Story of Adele H. from '75, a shattering portrayal of obsessive, unrequited love, based on the diaries of Adele Hugo, Victor Hugo's daughter. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1964. So take care, and I'll see you soon.